Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on territorial governance, party fracture, and compromise as a failed machine. The core question is this: how long can congressional compromise survive once every territorial procedure shifts the balance over slavery? The core competency is to describe the political events that resulted in declarations of secession.
How long can congressional compromise survive once every territorial procedure shifts the balance over slavery? The crisis of the 1850s began with geography. The Mexican-American War ended in 1848, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo brought a vast western cession under United States control. Congress now had to decide how those territories would be governed, when they would become states, and whether slavery could expand into them. These were procedural questions with explosive substance. A territorial bill determined who could settle, what property would be protected, which courts would operate, and how political power might shift in the future. The older compromise framework had balanced slave and free interests uneasily for decades. The Missouri Compromise Line of 1820 had offered one map-based answer to expansion. The new lands gained from Mexico unsettled that arrangement because they lay outside the old settlement and reopened the argument at a much larger scale. Every new map line became a forecast of future Senate seats, future House seats, future presidential coalitions, and future legal protections for slavery. The Wilmot Proviso, first introduced in 1846, signaled the conflict directly by proposing to bar slavery from territory acquired from Mexico. The proviso never became law, but its political effect was enormous. It forced congressmen to declare themselves more openly on expansion. That exposure strained old party coalitions, especially the national reach of the Democrats and Whigs. The issue was no longer whether slavery would continue where it already existed. The issue was what sort of empire the Republic would become in the West. This is where the narrative turns from the social roots of slavery to the political machine built around its defense. Congress still had procedures, committee systems, package deals, and floor votes. The system was functioning in a formal sense. The difficulty was that every use of the system now produced new distrust. Procedure did not neutralize slavery. It redistributed the fight into new chambers, new elections, and new territories. Henry Clay and other congressional leaders tried to calm the crisis with the Compromise of 1850. The package admitted California as a free state, settled the Texas boundary while assuming some of its debts, organized Utah and New Mexico territories without a direct congressional ban on slavery, ended the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act. Each measure addressed a separate part of the crisis, but together they formed a bargain meant to hold the Union together. The package worked legislatively because different interests could accept different pieces. California's admission favored free state interests. Southern leaders could point to the stronger fugitive law and to territorial openness. Moderates could claim that Congress had acted responsibly. Yet the settlement did not remove the conflict. It changed where the conflict would be felt most sharply. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 did more than almost any other piece of the compromise because it nationalized slavery's enforcement. Federal commissioners could issue warrants, marshals could summon bystanders into posies, alleged fugitives could be denied jury trial, and the testimony of the accused could be excluded. Fees paid to commissioners became a scandal because the law appeared to reward outcomes that favored slave claimants. A statute written in Washington now reached into northern streets, courtrooms, docks, and neighborhoods. Cases like that of Anthony Burns in Boston showed what the law looked like in practice. Burns, an alleged fugitive, was arrested in 1854. Federal troops and marshals guarded the courthouse and later escorted him through hostile crowds to a ship bound south. The spectacle radicalized many Northerners who had once treated slavery as a distant Southern institution. The law was forcing them to witness federal power in direct service of slave property. The compromise also extended uncertainty in the territories. Utah and New Mexico did not resolve the slavery issue cleanly. They postponed it through ambiguous local governance structures and future political development. That is the deeper lesson. Congressional packages were still passing, but each package transferred the burden to the next decision point. Procedure bought time while reducing trust. Stephen A. Douglas then attempted another procedural solution. He wanted territorial organization for Kansas and Nebraska in part because Western expansion, railroad routes, and party management all required it. His Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 organized those territories on the basis of popular sovereignty. Settlers, rather than Congress, would determine whether slavery would exist there. The act also undercut the Missouri Compromise line by reopening territory long assumed close to slavery. Popular sovereignty sounded clean on paper. Let local voters decide. In practice, it made the territorial process a race for control. Pro-slavery settlers crossed from Missouri. Anti-slavery settlers arrived through aid societies from the north. Newspapers advertised the stakes. Ballot boxes became targets. Territorial offices changed events because whoever controlled them could certify elections, shape militia authority, and claim legitimacy. Kansas soon produced rival governments. One operated from Lecompton with pro-slavery backing. Another gathered at Topeka with anti-slavery support. Fraudulent voting, intimidation, and armed clashes made the territorial question look less like constitutional settlement and more like rehearsal for civil war. John Brown's killings at Pottawatomie Creek and other episodes of violence showed that territorial politics had become armed politics. Congress absorbed that violence symbolically as well as practically. In 1856, Representative Preston Brooks assaulted Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor after Sumner denounced the slave power and mocked Southern allies. The caning changed events because it turned a speech dispute into bodily domination inside the national legislature itself. Northern newspapers used it as evidence that slaveholding politics relied on force. Southern admirers praised Brooks. The same event, therefore, widened sectional emotional distance even further. Party systems fractured under this pressure. The Whig Party collapsed. Free soil politics fed the rise of the Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. Northern Democrats followed Douglas uneasily. Southern Democrats demanded stronger guarantees, and old cross-sectional party language sounded less persuasive with each crisis. The breakdown was ideological at one level and organizational at another. Ballot coalitions that had once absorbed sectional tension began breaking apart under the territorial load. State and local party committees then had to choose new tickets, new newspapers, and new coalition language for voters who no longer trusted the older national bargains. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is the key source because it shows how legal language can sound neutral while reopening a deeply contested political order. The act declared that its true intent and meaning was not to legislate slavery into any territory or state, nor to exclude it therefrom, but instead to leave the question to local decision. That sentence became famous because it framed withdrawal by Congress as democratic restraint. The sentence does important structural work. Congress was not escaping the slavery issue. It was deciding to move the issue into territorial settlement and local electoral combat. That relocation changed the field of conflict. Once slavery became something migrants would determine on the ground, migration itself became political strategy. Aid societies, armed escorts, newspaper campaigns, and fraudulent voting were predictable outcomes of the legal design. The act also revealed how fragile older bargains had become. The Missouri Compromise had long functioned as a recognized line of political settlement. By reopening that arrangement, Congress taught voters that no earlier compromise was safe if present political pressure could overturn it. That lesson damaged confidence in future bargains. Why trust the next settlement if the last one can be revised when convenient? The act also clarified why many Northerners concluded that slaveholding interests kept demanding more than coexistence. A territorial measure that had looked administrative became evidence that the future map of slavery remained permanently unsettled. That fear helped build the Republican coalition. Many voters who had tolerated compromise as delay now saw delay itself as expansion by another method. Rid beside the violence in Kansas, the act loses any appearance of neutrality. Statutory language, local elections, armed settlement, and rival constitutions all belong to the same sequence. The law did not cause every later clash by itself, but it set the terms on which those clashes would occur. By the late 1850s, the Republic still had Congress, elections, courts, and parties, but fewer citizens trusted those institutions to manage slavery honestly. The Compromise of 1850 had nationalized fugitive enforcement. Kansas-Nebraska had reopened territorial settlement. Bleeding Kansas had shown what local decision could look like. Sumner's caning had turned congressional conflict into national spectacle. The old language of moderation grew weaker because each new compromise appeared to deepen rather than contain the conflict. This is why compromise in the 1850s can be described as a failed machine. The machine still produced laws, but the laws transferred pressure into new settings where violence, distrust, and party fracture intensified. Federal authority entered northern communities to recover fugitives. Territorial governance produced rival constitutions. Elections in Kansas carried the weight of national destiny. Congressional debates now sounded to many listeners like contests between incompatible social orders rather than bargaining among temporary rivals. Compromise failed unevenly. For some Americans, especially committed unionists, the very passage of legislation still looked like evidence that the Republic could survive. For others, especially anti-slavery Northerners and hardline Southern defenders of expansion, each law proved that ordinary politics was either morally bankrupt or insufficiently protective. The constitutional system was losing not only policy fights, but also legitimacy among growing groups of voters. The sequence set up the final movement towards secession. Once party alignments crack, once territorial governance produces armed camps, and once federal law visibly protects slave property in free state settings, election outcomes become harder to absorb peacefully. Dred Scott, John Brown, Lincoln's victory, and the secession conventions make more sense once the machine's wear is already visible. The Lecompton Constitution added one more layer to the breakdown. Pro-slavery leaders in Kansas drafted a constitution at Lecompton in 1857 and sought admission to the Union under it. President James Buchanan supported the effort, but Stephen Douglas opposed it because he believed the process had been manipulated and lacked legitimate territorial consent. That split damaged the Democratic Party even further. A party that had once held Northern and Southern wings together was now fighting over whether popular sovereignty itself had been honestly applied. The Lecompton fight is decisive because it shows compromise failing inside procedure, not outside it. Committees, conventions, admissions bills, and presidential endorsements were all still operating. Yet each instrument now deepened suspicion. Anti-slavery Northerners saw slaveholding fraud in the Constitution. Southern hardliners saw Northern resistance as proof that no settlement would be respected unless slavery won outright. Douglas tried to preserve a middle position, but the middle position was losing credibility in both directions. By the end of the decade, the Republic had moved from negotiating limits to disputing the legitimacy of its own mechanisms. Territorial government no longer looked like routine expansion. It looked like a test of whether slavery or free labor would control the future West. The judgment problem should stay live at the end. Which mechanism did the most damage to compromise? The territorial question, the Fugitive Slave Act, popular sovereignty, or party fracture? The strongest answer may connect them. Territorial expansion opened the question. Fugitive enforcement carried slavery into Northern civic life. Popular sovereignty armed settlement politics. Party fracture removed the national coalitions that had once softened sectional conflict. Together, they turned congressional procedure into a pathway toward disunion. Print culture carried that pathway into ordinary political life. Reports from Kansas, Boston, Washington, and local party meetings moved through partisan papers and regional weeklies. Voters who would never see the plains or a federal courthouse still read about fraudulent elections, fugitive arrests, canings, and territorial constitutions. The crisis therefore spread through text as well as through law. Congressional procedure became household reading, and household reading fed sharper sectional identity. Procedure kept moving the slavery fight into new territories, new elections, and new forms of armed pressure without settling the underlying dispute. The harder judgment is whether compromise still deserved loyalty once each bargain redistributed conflict instead of containing it. Congressional order survived on paper while political legitimacy kept wearing down.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.